Star Ocean is a decisive series in the world of RPGs. For all of its entries, there are sadly only a few that cross over into the realm of being considered, well, good. Star Ocean 2 is definitely one of those games. In fact, it's often considered one of the best and classic games of its era. Now, Square Enix has deemed it finally time for another re-release of this classic RPG adventure. This isn't just a new port, but rather a surprising remake and remaster of a beloved game that might just be the definitive way to enjoy it. Let's see what I mean in this review of Star Ocean Second Story R. The first thing most will notice about it is its look, taking the classic PS1 sprites for characters and tossing them into a full 3D environment. The classic game featured pre-rendered backgrounds which looked fine for their time, but will obviously struggle as time goes on. Instead of taking the upscaling route, everything has been completely remade. The new look is quite charming and vibrant. Somehow the game just seems brighter and more enjoyable this time around. Honestly, I love the look of the simple 3D backgrounds. They're sharp enough to pop, so to speak, but they're not so detailed that it completely ruins the vibe of being a PlayStation 1 era RPG. Tossing in the OG sprite work for the characters works well too, giving it a unique look. Some might not like it, but I personally enjoy the look that it has. The effects for attacks and whatnot have also been redone, and they're more bombastic than before, but honestly, given the chaotic nature of the game's combat, the new effects kind of obscure more of the action than maybe they intended to. It makes for exciting moments, but also some frustrating ones when you get tagged by a random hidden attack or some other kind of nonsense. Jumping into the combat proper, it's been completely reworked just like most of the game. It's still the button mashy flashy attack spamming that we all know and loved, but with a bit more direction applied to it. Over the years, Star Ocean's combat has generally been quite praised, even if the rest of the games have a more mixed response. This time around, some of those positive points have been pulled over into this remake to mix things up a bit. Like the entries that came after Star Ocean 2, there are bonuses for playing well across multiple battles. These bonuses are general buffs, but they can really make the difference in some battles, given the various difficulty spikes that the game has for the unprepared. New to the game is a dodge. Doing so at the right time will not only avoid damage, but it'll put the character behind the enemy. It's a neat mechanic at a glance, but given the speed of things and how much is going on, I honestly didn't use it as much as I'd like. You really have to be deliberate with it, and doing so just kind of breaks the flow of things. Another new bit to the combat is armor and breaking enemies. Armored enemies can be broken with enough hard-hitting attacks. Doing so stuns them, and even makes a shockwave that breaks other enemies around them. Occasionally, larger enemies will appear that provide buffs to all enemies until their armor is dealt with. It's a pretty unique and nice new addition to the combat. These new bits add some welcome depth to the combat that didn't exist before, but have been points of praise in other entries. It's pretty neat that they brought these ideas into an older entry without stepping on the game's toes.
Brought something back, have you? Let's have a look.
Here you go. What do you think?
Characters and story are definitely things we have to talk about as well because, you know, it's an RPG and all. The characters in Star Ocean 2 are a highlight of the adventure. The cast is fairly large with 12 total, but only 8 of them being available in any playthrough. That means for the dedicated, a playthrough of both main characters and specific decisions about who you recruit will be needed to see everything. Star Ocean 2 features 2 main characters, Claude and Rena. Claude is an Earthling who gets separated from his main group while exploring in space, and Rena is a native of the planet that the majority of the game takes place on. They go on an adventure to find their way home, but also to discover more about themselves. It's an interesting adventure, and once again, the main points always intersect with each other, but their two different perspectives mean quite a lot if you do two separate playthroughs. What makes the characters great is how much information we get about them and their personalities. While their involvement in the main scenario is more superficial for obvious reasons, the game gives you plenty to love about them with their own personal actions. Personal actions are short stories that litter the game's runtime. These tell you more about the characters and even have their own little arcs of events. Back in the day, these were super easy to miss and some were even timed. Now though, they're marked clearly on the map and can be fast traveled to at basically any time. The quality of life changes here to mark them and make them instantly accessible made me go through as many of them as I could, and honestly I'm glad I did it. A lot of them are super interesting or comical, and none of them are so long that I felt like I had to skip it. Some even lead to various side events or areas, so they felt worth doing. The reason I praise the characters and personal actions is, well, Star Ocean 2's story isn't exactly great if you ask me. While there is plenty to praise about the game, I wouldn't say that the story was one of them. To be honest, it's a pretty unbalanced affair and it's held up by a lot of the game's other good points. While the game does have two different leads to follow and see their particular perspectives, major points all converge in the same ways. The problem is that it's not that great. It begins with us searching for one MacGuffin to reach, and it never actually feels like it's a priority until it suddenly is. And then the game shifts into its second half, and honestly then it just kind of ends. Like I said, the main scenario isn't great here, but it's held up by the rest of the experience, thankfully. While the main story is kind of disappointing, all of the things in between really hold the adventure together. Things like a fighting tournament and saving children from bandits and more are all the usual kind of RPG tropes that exist, but in honesty, these little moments and all of their character tidbits are really interesting and kind of makes the adventure worth having.
Oh, really?
The way you folks carried
Star Ocean 2 is a deceptively open game for a Japanese RPG of its time. It's got a ton of crafting and optional abilities to learn. This time around, the game presents them in a much more digestible way for new players, or even older ones like me. Leveling up these optional abilities opens things up in a way that aren't necessary but add so much to the experience. Being able to craft new accessories with randomized stats from the shop versions or unique equipment is just the icing on the cake. Not to mention the variety of abilities that have all kinds of effects, like being able to fish or make books to sell, see concept art, and more. It's a much bigger experience than it leads on with. And like I said, the quality of life changes here presented in a much better way, which is great. Along those lines there's a fast travel now, markers for the main story and side quests, autosaves, and much more. The entire game is just that much better by adding all of this, helping players do exactly what they want without wasting too much time or missing anything that they don't want to skip. Though it is weird that this game has a fast forward function in cutscenes. There's not much movement to take advantage of this on, honestly, and its voiced lines are still read at the normal speed. It's a strange one. Also, I did notice a few random grammatical and text errors here and there, but these are pretty negligible and I'm sure they'll get patched out eventually. Star Ocean Second Story R is easily one of the best RPG remakes we've gotten from Square Enix. It's a great game in general, and its weak story is more than made up for by the other positives like characters and ease of play. Toss in multiple vocal and audio tracks, tons of extras and Easter eggs, and you'll see why this was such a charmer back then, and still remains one. Star Ocean Second Story R gets an 8 from me, and it's an easy recommendation for fans of this classic, or those who have been hearing its praises for all of these years, but never tried it out for themselves. This is a brilliant remake and definitely one that's worth a look, But that is going to be it for this review. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to like, sub, and hit the notifications for more of my reviews when I crank them out. Here's to a great new year and more channel growth, hopefully. Be safe out there, and I hope you have a great, happy new year, and I hope to see you again next time.